So this is a big pile of wood that I'm going to make into a segmented hollow form. I ripped all the widths of my pieces and I marked them all on one side so that I know what side all the segments are going to be once I make all my cuts. Make sure you stick around to the end to learn some of my tips and tricks on how to assemble the segments easily. So tip 1 is to make sure that your saw blade is square to your table. So to do this, I'm using a Wixie digital angle gauge, which makes it really easy to adjust your saw blade. So with the power turned off and the breaker turned off, I'm going to start by raising my saw blade up. Then with the gauge sitting flat on the table, I'm going to power it on. And so I don't even need to hit the 0 button, but if that wasn't saying 0.0, hit the 0 button to 0 it out. And then it's got magnets, stick it right to the side of your blade. I'm off just a tiny bit. And that's it. Now I know my blade is 90 degrees to the table, so it'll cut perfectly straight. Just put my throat plate back on. And now it's time to get my segmenting sled onto the table. So Mike over at Quality First Wood Products sent me one of their Wedge Pro sleds to try out. So first thoughts are that it's very safety oriented. It's got a lot of stuff to keep your hands away from the saw blade. It came with the sled, and it also came with a depth guide so that you can measure your segment lengths. I didn't bother going through how to set the sled up because they have a really extensive video on their channel that I'll link below that tells you everything that you need to know to get the sled set up right, and I'll put a link directly to the sled too if you want to check it out. Alright, so I use a software program to generate a cut list and design my segmented turnings. There's a lot of them out there. I like using Segmented Pro and Woodturner Pro depending on what I want to make. You could do some research and see if it's right for you. I know Segmented Pro and Woodturner Pro both offer 30-day free trials. So the first thing I need to do is I need to adjust my measuring gauge for my first segment that I'm going to cut. The Segmented Pro does it in decimals, so it's easier just to use a set of digital calipers to get my measurement. So we're going to lock that in, and then I'm going to make my first cut. So my first cut's just going to be barely enough to cut the end off, and then every other cut you're going to flip over because this is only a one angled sled. So I got the board adjusted onto the sled. I'm going to turn the saw on. With my hands away from the blade, I'm just going to push it through the blade. Now I'm going to move the sled back to where my gauge is. Put in the gauge. This is a locking arm, so it'll hold the board tight to the fence. And I'm going to make my first cut. Just flip it and repeat. So the sled also has a piece on it that pulls the segment that you cut out of the way of the blade. So now that I have all my segments cut, the next thing I need to do is I need to glue them all into the rings. I like to number all the pieces of each ring. That way I can just make them into piles and not worry about losing a piece. I like to cut all my segments before I start the glue up. There's a couple different ways that you can glue segments up. If you have really tight fitting rings without any gaps, you can just do like I'm going to do now and use a piece of string, because the segments don't need to be like clamped tight, because the actual structure of the final glue up is when you glue all the rings together. End grain gluing isn't really all that structurally sound. So I'm just applying glue to one side of each segment. Not really worrying about pushing the segments together yet until I get glue applied on all of them. And I'm just using a tight bond glue, but there's a lot of different wood glues out there. Alright, so now that I have glue applied to all my segments, I just want to start putting them together. You want to work a little bit fast because you don't want to have the glue start to set up before you get all the segments pulled tight together. Okay, everything's relatively lined up, so now we're going to grab a piece of string, and I just got a little 3/4 by 3/4 block of wood with a hole drilled through the center of it that I use so I can pull it tight, and a little plastic spring clip which applies enough pressure to hold the string from slipping. So I pull it a little bit tight, make sure all my segments are lined up now. I'm just going to pull it close to the edge so that I can really give a little last tweak, make sure everything is nice tight to the table. You always want to work on a flat surface when you're doing this too. Alright, so we're just going to let that sit for a while so that the glue dries, and then we'll be done with that segment. Alright, so another way to clamp your rings together is just by using a worm screw hose clamp. So I'm going to do the same steps where I'm going to just apply a little bit of glue to one side of each segment. Okay, so the glue's all applied. Just start shrinking the segment in to get everything all lined up. I'm going to take my hose clamp and lasso it around. They got a slot on them, but I prefer to use a socket. Makes it a little bit easier. So it's snug, so we're going to got to reposition the worm drive on this clamp. It's a little bit in the way. Make sure everything is lined up and that everything is pressed down flat. And let's give a few more. Okay. So that rings together. So we're just going to set this one aside and let the glue dry on that one too. Alright, so the last way that you can glue your rings up is with a slip or a friction joint. So if you have a segment where the pieces aren't exactly lining up 100%, you can build it in pieces and then do minor sanding to some of the joints to make the segment line up tight. So what you're going to want to do is, I would say for 16, just work in 4 segments at a time. So all you do is put glue on one side and then rub the joint back and forth a few times. And actually the suction from the glue is going to hold the joint together good enough that it'll glue together with a tight joint. So what you're going to do is you're going to do 4 at a time for this. And then that's enough for that one. And then we're going to come and we're going to do another 4. And then once all these joints dry, we'll come and we'll start gluing the sets of 4 together. Okay, so I have my 4/4 of the ring glued together, so I'm just going to let the glue set up on this, and then we will come back and we'll glue each quarter into 2 halves, and then we'll be able to make any adjustments to get the final glue up together. So now that I have my 4/4 glued together, the next thing I need to do is glue them into halves. So I'm just going to apply some glue on 2 sides and then just do another rub joint. Make sure it's lined together and nice and tight, and do the same thing for this side. Now we're going to let those sit and dry, and then we will just do one more glue joint to glue both of those halves together. Now that my 2 halves are all glued up, the next thing I need to do is glue them both together. As you can see, I placed them together since I did slip or friction joints. I got a little bit of a gap on this side that I need to correct, and we're going to do that with a sheet of sandpaper. So this is just a 100 grit sheet of sandpaper, and all I'm going to do is on a flat surface. Just carefully slide it back and forth, making sure that it's sitting flat on the paper. So we're almost there, just a little bit more, and then that side will be done. And all I'm doing is I'm setting it on top of my flat surface and just making sure that there's no gaps in between. Okay, now I'm just going to do the other side. Alright, let's test fit and see where we got. Alright, so now that I have it all lined up, I just need to do one last glue up. And we're going to do the same thing, just put them together and rub back and forth. Alright, so we just gotta let that glue dry, and then that last ring is all assembled. Alright, so all my segmented rings are glued together, so the next step I need to do is I need to sand the tops and the bottoms so that they're flat, so that they'll glue together nice and easy. So this is just a plywood disc that's got a 12-inch sanding disc glued to it, and it's mounted onto a faceplate. So these rings are 3/4 of an inch thick, so there's plenty of meat to keep my fingers away from the discs. All I'm doing is lightly touching it. Check it a little bit, make sure that I'm getting everything flat. Okay, so that's good for the one side. Then we're going to flip it over and do the same thing to the other side. Alright, so that's one ring. Just do that for all the rings. So one thing you could do to make sanding the smaller discs a little easier is you could bring your tool rest up just to rest the disc on. Just rotate it every few seconds. Okay, one side sanded. Alright, so that disc is done, so I'm just going to do this for all of the rings. So now that my rings are all glued together, the next thing we need to do is glue them all into a stack. I'm going to do my stack in 2 halves, that way it'll make it easier to hollow it out on the lathe. So I'm starting off, I cut this 4.5 inch disc with a tenon on one end that will fit in my chuck. This is going to be for the bottom of the hollow form. I need to get this on and centered, so I'm just going to take a couple small pieces of double-sided tape. Put them on the tenon and peel the back side off. We're going to do one more piece. This is just to get this to stick temporarily to my segment press so that I can put it all together. So now that we have that, we're just going to lower this down. Alright, so now that we have that centered on the press, we just need to start adding in the rings. Alright, so on to the first ring. I'm just using an old Longworth chuck that I have that I don't use anymore to help me center all of my rings to make sure that the stack is as close to centered as possible. So I'm going to open the chuck up a little bit. That's good. We're going to put some glue on the top of the ring. Get it spread around a little bit. That should be enough for the first, so we're going to put in a Longworth chuck, close it down until it's centered, and then we're going to lower the base piece with the tenon on it. Make sure it's centered all the way around, and just give it, you don't need to go crazy with the pressure, and then just let that sit for a little bit for the glue to start drying, and then we can add our next ring in. Alright, so the glue for the first ring is set up enough, so next thing we're going to do is we are going to Release the tension a little bit. Widen the long worst chuck up a little bit. Bring what I got glued together up high enough to get the next ring in, and then we're going to slip the next ring down in place. Is that one centered? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to apply some glue just to the area where the ring we already glued on is going to sit. Okay, that should be enough glue. Then we're going to slip that ring in. Tighten down the long worst chuck to lock that in place, and then lower the press back down. Make sure it looks centered, and then put a little bit more pressure on it, and we're going to let that ring glue up. So another way you can glue up your rings is just to use your lathe. So here I have my smallest ring for the other side attached to a chuck, and I'm going to be using my sanding disc as a press plate to press all the ring sections together. So what I'm going to do is just same thing, a little bit of glue around the area where the smallest ring will be pressed against it. Put it in, and one thing you want to do that you need to do is align your joints so that they're in the center of the previous segments. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of spin just to make sure that everything looks like it's good to go, and then just apply a little bit of pressure. Let that sit for a few minutes, and then we'll add another ring. Alright, so now that's set for a few minutes so the glue won't release. We'll back our plate out a little bit. Grab our next disc. Again, put a little bit of glue just where the previous ring is going to press onto it because the previous ring was smaller than this one. We'll slip it in, make sure everything looks like it's lined up, and then before I tighten it, we'll just get it a spin. That looks pretty good. Tighten that one down, let that sit for a few minutes, and then we'll just continue with the last two rings. Now that I have my two halves glued together, the next thing I need to do is turn the inside, then glue it all together, and then turn the outside. I'm going to turn this into a basket weave illusion, and I want to have the beads and the coloring on the inside as well, so I'm going to be turning this in another video, so keep an eye out for it. I should have that video out soon.